Join us on a journey where we unravel the latest trends, tackle your burning questions, and explore innovative strategies that are shaping the future of compensation, all with a cup of coffee in hand. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Comp and Coffee, where we dig into the conversations that matter most in compensation, HR, and business strategy. I'm your host, Ruth Thomas, Chief Compensation Strategist here at PayScale, and today we're talking about the moment every comp professional knows too well, when the CFO asks why, and potentially when the CFO says no. It's a question that can shake your confidence unless you're prepared. So in this episode, we're exploring how to defend pay decisions without panic by aligning HR and finance around a shared strategy. And I thought it would be fun for this episode to bring our very own PayScale CFO and CPO together to have that discussion to see how the friction or non-friction goes down here at PayScale. So joining me today, I have Lexi Clarke, Chief People Officer, regular on the podcast. Welcome back, Lexi. And Philip Watson, newbie on the podcast, our Chief Financial Officer. So, Philip, as you're a newbie, do you want to introduce yourself first to the audience? Just give a brief introduction.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Ruth. Happy to be here. First time caller, first time listener as well. But I'm Philip Watson. I have been CFO here at PayScale for 6 months or so now. Previously was CFO at a fintech company in London before this. And then have kind of been in FP&A and finance my whole post-business school career and always in software. So very excited about the opportunity to have this discussion with my dear friend and sometimes sparring partner on these items, Lexi Clarke.
Okay, Lexi, he sparred it over to you. Do you want to introduce yourself?
I love it. I'm Lexi Clarke, Chief People Officer at PayScale. I've said it once, I'll say it again. Every time I get an ask to come back, I feel like I didn't do anything wrong the last time. So happy to be back and happy for this conversation with my guy, Philip, today. I'm excited about this topic. For those of you who I have not met or listening for the first time, most of my background pre-PayScale was in early to mid-stage tech in the Seattle area. I'm usually in the Seattle area, which means I'm still drinking my coffee as we record this, whereas my friends, Ruth and Philip, may be preparing for gin and tonic at any moment over in London. We keep saying we'll do a gin and tonic podcast, Ruth, or a Chardonnay and comp and Chardonnay, something.
Comp and Chardonnay.
Yeah. Comp after dark. That would be interesting at some point.
Yeah. That's one maybe we need to do live at an event somewhere, I think. Yeah. So in Las Vegas would seem appropriate as well.
That feels great.
Yeah. Okay. So when I consider the relationship between the CPO and the CFO, I think to some degree, it's potentially set up for conflict when it comes to managing the ROI of compensation, because compensation really sits at that intersection of talent strategy, talent investment, I like to call it, talent insurance, I also like to call it, and then financial performance. So HR and finance often have different mandates, one focused on attracting, retaining talent, maintaining the talent franchise, and the other on managing costs and hitting margin targets. So Lexi, where's your perspective on this, and where do you see the opportunity for divergence happening here?
Yeah, I mean, I think and I think Philip and I have talked about this before, but we'll see if we align live while we do this. But I think about in a lot of organizations, you can say finance and people run, to your point, Ruth, with a divergence or with a point of friction. I always think about that as the best partnerships include healthy friction. And Philip said it during his introduction, a little bit of sparring, a little bit of challenging each other, right? To think a little bit differently. I think the best way is, obviously, I think Ruth, you outlined where, I and my team spend a lot of time maximizing our time around people and, all of those things. And obviously, Philip and the finance team are maximizing time around some of the financial outcomes and the goals, right? Of what we are shooting towards as an organization. In the best world, those things frequently and constantly overlap. And in the best organizations, I actually think that there's this intertwine. And it doesn't always mean that, one side is right necessarily, but I think the best way to describe it is it should be a partnership where there is both alignment early and often, and also challenge when it really makes sense. when I think about that from like a CPO perspective or like an HR perspective, that means being data driven with trade-offs and some of those things when I'm having conversations with Philip or his team. But, I think the most important thing, like philosophically, I think that healthy friction is the way that I would describe it. And I think like, where Philip and I have really started to like build our partnership over the last 6 months is like finding those spots to align, finding the places to challenge each other in those right moments. And I think learning from those moments and being like, okay, great. And how would we do this going forward if we didn't have all this history that we were trying to solve for? We had a long conversation about part of that yesterday, Philip. So I feel like I think that there's like, those have been really fruitful conversations, but I think about that conceptually as, you should acknowledge the healthy point of friction, but find the times where it's right to challenge each other. But again, aligning early, often proactively, I think those things are really important too.
And so from the other side of the boxing ring, Philip, how would you respond to that?
I think everything Lexi said makes sense. I probably put it in slightly different words. Like she used healthy friction. I think I call it healthy tension. But it's okay to have people think about problems differently and try to solve them differently, as long as everybody's driving to the same kind of overarching goal. And so the best teams I've worked on, everybody was driving to that overarching goal, whether that be, let's do this piece of M&A, let's go drive to this exit, let's get to this revenue figure, let's get to this profitability figure, whatever the goal may be in whatever time frame. Everybody's going to have a different view. Everybody's going to have a different lens at how they look at the problem. And like, that's okay. We actually want that. Like, I'm not an HR person. I'm not going to say I'm not a people person, because that's not true. But I'll say I'm not an HR person. And Lexi's not a finance person. So I don't expect her to approach the world the way I see it. And I don't think she expects me to approach the world the way she sees it. We need to have overlap, and we need to be able to have that translation layer where I can understand what she's saying and she can understand what I'm saying. But it does allow us two different ways to try to attack the problem. And I think that only works if you trust the other people on your team and you're rowing in the same boat, to use one of my favorite phrases, and you're driving to that same conclusion.
Great. So we've been talking a lot recently about what keeps comp pros up at night. So when you're preparing for a conversation, Lexi, with Philip, potentially about preparing for budgets, what's the single biggest fear or challenge that you have when you think about going into that budget discussion and defending those pay decisions to the CFO?
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest point of like fear, right? Like to what Philip highlighted, right? Like he is a people person. He's not an HR person, but I'm not a finance person. Is like, I mean, you're going as like a comp professional, or also maybe as an HR person, like you're going into like finance territory when you're talking about comp season. And by that, I mean, like you are going into a place where, and I'll use Philip and team as the example, they have like data and analytical rigor, right? And so the biggest like fear and anxiety is like, do I have enough data and rigor and optionality in these conversations to show up in a way where I'm speaking the language that, they understand, and I'm bringing the right things to the table? And also, am I bringing, my point of view from the, the people side of things? And that frequently is driven by data to this conversation. But I think also like, it is not a conversation that you can show up for without prep. And like, I think about that as like anytime that I have to talk to, I call it math time with Philip. Anytime that Philip and I are talking math, I'm like, okay, we got to make sure the numbers are tracking and the math is mathing. But what I mean by that is like a lot of comp pros and practitioners are analytical people, but I think you can get really sucked into like the analytical pieces around the benchmark instead of, hey, let's look at the actual compensation budget we're looking for year over year. Let's reference some of the data of what we're seeing in the market. Let's put that data in the market in context in which I can understand, and let me understand the financial goals that Philip and his team are already thinking about for the next year. So I think like the anxiety comes from, do you have the right kind of analytical and data-driven pieces to go into that conversation? And I would say, and we'll probably talk about this a couple times, like I'm a big believer in optionality. Like when I go to Philip and team to talk about the 26 budget, my intention would be I bring 3 options. And those 3 options are like, here's the trade-off with each option. Here's what we would think about. Here's the historical context. And that optionality, again, is to put it in a bigger picture so that, as in a really kind of healthy way, Philip and team would kind of push us to think a little bit differently, that we're ready for that conversation. And I think that guides a better discussion.
And what are the key things that you're looking for, Philip, when during that kind of budget conversation, when you ask why, as the CFO, what really matters to you?
Yeah. I mean, not to give away my own secrets, so I guess I will. Part of the question of why is, can the person presenting this defend what they have to say? Right? Wasn't just put down on paper. Was it lazy work, or was there actual thought behind it? Is I think always a thing I think through. And I think that's what really drives my first question. Okay, I see this, tell me more and show me that you have thought through this. The fact that Lexi brings multiple options is certainly helpful, but she said a word that I think is really important, especially in dealing with a finance person, which is more trade-offs. Most people don't think about the trade-offs, I would say. So there's a cost to everything, even to the thing that may feel costless. There is certainly a cost, whether that be time or energy or opportunity costs, which is certainly a concept that most people don't give enough credence to. And so understanding that is really important in anything you're trying to do, but I think is actually really important when you're thinking through numbers and more importantly, medium and long-term strategy. So, from a finance perspective, maybe what my friends over in HR, don't understand or haven't traditionally understood is when we talk about numbers for, let's call it the next year, that I'm not thinking about just the next year. Right? I have to think about the year behind that and the year behind that and the 2 years behind that. I need to think 5 years out. And so any action we take in the next year certainly has consequences going forward for the 4 years after that. And I'm not sure a lot of people think about it like that. And that is how good finance people think about it. That's how my team thinks about it. And that's how it should be thought of. So the concept of trade-offs is really important. And I think it gives me comfort to know that the numbers have thought behind them and that those trade-offs are at least acknowledged, if maybe not fully understood, because sometimes they're hard and such, and sometimes they're just not knowable, but that they're at least acknowledged and talked to, if nothing else.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought about that before, about having the 4-year plan. So I know on Comp and Coffee we have people that listen in kind of all levels of experience. So I mean, I think for me the connection really works is you can't just turn up with this is what I think I need to hire the people I need. It's basically what you need to be able to do is to make that connection between what talent do I need to deliver the business results that we have outlined in our operating plan. And that's how you really need to think about the conversation. So normally, comp people are quite good at we do the market benchmarking. We come up with, it used to be a lot easier when every year it was only a 3% budget that we ever had to work with. So it was almost like lifting it off the shelf. And it's got a little bit more complex in the world that we live in today. But really taking that next step in terms of that, what I'm asking for, how is that going to deliver in terms of, the AOP, and to your point, Lexi, giving options there. Well, if we invest this is the potential outcome, or we invest scenario B, this is the potential outcome.
Yeah, and I think that the only thing I would add to Philip's point that I think is really important from a finance lens, if you are a practitioner and you're listening and you're only focused on compensation, I think that total rewards focus is a critical part of that conversation. And I'll use us as the example, even though Philip was not here during, our planning for 25. One of the things that we've talked about is hey, we ran, a normal compensation budget, but oh, by the way, we increased our 401k match. And also we had a big benefits renewal because the US benefits continue to go up year over year. That is a massive investment from to Philip's point on the building. I know that going into 26, I'm oh man, okay, I need to take into account how much did we increase in terms of both compensation, but from a fully burdened. standpoint in the last year, and what does that build look like as we look at 2026 and then beyond as well. So like I would just encourage as a tip, like if you are not as tied in with your benefits team or that open enrollment process or some of those things, especially within the US where there's been a lot of volatility, that is like the full total reward story. And even though sometimes timing wise, those conversations don't always happen at exactly the same time, they're similar enough timing where you should be pulling that as a data point into those conversations.
Yeah, that's a good.
I mean, I think that's a perfect example of the concept of the trade-offs, right? Like not all compensation is cash. Not all compensation is salary. There's bonus, there's equity, there's myriad of benefits, particularly in the States, maybe less so internationally, although certainly some internationally, right? And so what you have is a matrix, and you have a series of dials, and you can turn those dials, but you can't turn them all the way to the right. There's got to be some mixture in there, and so it's I don't know what that mixture is, right? But Lexi and her team do, and they help us think about this is the right mixture of this pot that we can pull from to get the best talent and to drive that talent to go accomplish the things in the plan that we are laying out. I think that's super valuable, but I think that really, Lexi's comments there really highlighted the idea of the trade-offs and why I think they're so important.
Yeah. Now, I mean, obviously we've talked about the natural tension or friction in this relationship, but I think there's one thing that the two roles can align around, and that is when you think about compensation strategy and you think about compensation philosophy, because compensation philosophy should be something that the whole leadership team is aligned around. It's compensation ultimately is your lever for growth. It's your lever for fostering culture within the organization and competitiveness. And of course, it's a line item on the P&L. So really, whatever you've agreed as a leadership team around the compensation philosophy should help to kind of you to align in this relationship. Philip, from your finance lens, how does misalignment on compensation philosophy create stress or lost opportunities?
Yeah, when I think about this, I think about, hey, do we want to reward everybody equally? Do we want to reward top performers more? Do we want to reward lower performers less? Do we want to reward lower comp people more than higher comp people, or vice versa? I'm thinking kind of maybe the context of merit here, for example, when I say reward. If we're not aligned as an organization on how to think about that, it's just going to burn so many cycles in the planning process that can certainly be used more constructively. And two, I think it may lead to a little bit of whiplash amongst the people you're actually trying to help, because what you could potentially be doing in that situation is 1 year doing one thing, and another year doing another thing, and another year doing another thing, or even maybe intra-year in your various merit cycles, kind of rewarding different things. This may be a shocker as a CFO, but I'm a big fan of consistency, right? And picking the right thing and having variations that be pretty small, allowing you to kind of turn the dials, but turn them within relatively small ranges to optimize, as opposed to making big, massive changes in any one thing over short periods of time. So I think if you're not aligned philosophically, at best, it burns a lot of cycles. At worst, it kind of leaks out to the rest of the org and causes some disillusionment, probably a loss of morale and things like that. Could ultimately cost you the ability to go hire the right people too. I mean, ultimately, we're all running people businesses, right? About 2/3 of practically every company, at least in the States, is cost or comp related. So we're essentially all running people businesses. And if you either can't bring on the people that you need to go make your business successful, or retain the people that you have that already make your business successful, you're gonna be in a tough spot. And so I think not having an aligned philosophy or being aligned in your philosophy are certainly headwinds to getting and keeping the people that you need.
So it really underlines that importance of coming to agreement. Lexi, any good examples or bad examples of where that alignment hasn't happened?
Yeah, I don't know as much at the time at PayScale, and that's not just saying that for the podcast, by the way. That I think is I don't think we've had maybe egregious misalignment, but I have experienced it at other organizations where that tie was not as close. And I would call it, this is a silly way to put it, but when there's not alignment, you've got all the things that Philip just highlighted. You also have this credibility thing internally of going to mom and dad and shopping for different answers, or dad and dad or mom and mom, whatever the case might be. And that shows up at like the executive team level, that shows up within the organization. And there's like it's a weird dynamic that I think can like undermine the actual reality of what you're trying to solve for. Like Philip does this great thing where, and it pains me, Philip, to tell you how great it is. But Philip does this great thing where, he'll go back and say, well, what problem are we trying to solve? Like, what are we trying to solve for, to like reground the conversation? I think when you're in like a back and forth and maybe the HR team and finance team is not in alignment, you lose sight of like the problem you're trying to solve and get into kind of this like battle back and forth of whose answer is going to win. So I think like to everything Philip highlighted, I couldn't agree more. Like I think when you see that misalignment happen, you're just ultimately not making the right decisions, both for people, but for the business. And those losses of talent have real business impact, right? Like think about major initiatives in R&D where you lose that critical person that knows how to code that thing, right? Or in sales where you lose a top seller that actually has a real impact on revenue within that quarter or longer term. Like all of those things are real impacts. But I also think like internally, like I have worked in organizations where that power dynamic or imbalance is real. And it causes this weirdness of like, who do you go to? How do you get answers? By the way, numbers are completely separate from people decisions. And that can cause a little bit of just like chaos, I think, at trying to like get anything done.
I would say Philip and I have both worked in investment banking for many years, and that probably is an environment where that happens quite often. That's probably a whole other podcast.
And I can guess where the power dynamic is there, by the way. I can guess. I have a couple guesses. Maybe that's a Chardonnay and comp.
Yeah, maybe. Right. So here at PayScale, we're in the middle of our mid-year cycle actually at the moment. I know this is typically August, as we're recording this, is the time when comp pros is just starting to like wrap up all the research that they've done over the middle of the year and prepare budgets. Either they're in mid-year or you're getting ready for your year-end process. So let's get a little bit more tactical in terms of some tips for them. When you're getting prepared for budget season, Lexi, what are some of the things that keep you up at night about that?
So I actually will use this mid-year as like a good example of this, because like to what we said before, like Philip was not in seat when we did 25 planning. So as we think about like hitting this mid-year cycle that we're in right now, like this was an opportunity, I think, to realign with Philip and his team around like, hey, when we went into this year, here's what our assumptions were. Here's, by the way, what we've already spent. Hey, I want to like validate this number against how, you folks are re-racking the budget. And oh, by the way, like, here's where I think we should make investment, or here's where I think we shouldn't. And like, can we align on this before then we go to our executive team? I think the steps to be prepared from that perspective is like, this is an interesting year for us, because I think like as we're building and operating, Philip and I are also aligning at the same time. I'm excited to go into 26 because we get to like spend a good chunk of time being like, okay, great. How do we want it to go? Like, what's the ideal situation of how we do this moving forward? But I think like, the steps, and I'll use that maybe tactically as an example, the steps we took was like, let's pull how much we spent this year. Let's go and pull why we invested that much, or what was like our logic or methodology. Let's pull the reality of what we've spent in previous years. So like those previous reference points and a breakdown of like what we spent and how we spent it was really important for a historical reference. I think within Philip's first week, I was like, hey, by the way, here's our comp philosophy. Like, we'll talk about it a million more times, but like, I just want you to have it. Cause that was like an important kind of grounding piece. And like, well, we resurfaced like that, inclusive of like promo methodology, how we benchmark, like what ranges we use, some of those things. And then there's like the qualitative kind of like, not squishier, but a little squishier talent conversation of like, okay, here's all the numbers. Philip, here's what I think we should do. And here's where I think we have an opportunity, both on process, but also on talent. And here's why I think that, whether that's industry-driven, company-driven, financial kind of goals-driven. And then we get to have the conversation around like, what are your reactions? What questions would you have for me? Thoughts, all of those other things. So I pull together all the quantitative stuff, like all the things that you would think would drive that conversation. But there's this qualitative story, like narrative overlay, and the context that I think is also important. And like that leads us to say, okay, here's the trade-offs, here's the alignment, here's what we're going to agree on. And oh, by the way, like Philip and I do that before we get into conversations with other people. And I think that is an important part of the step, is if him and I can go into a conversation with our CEO or our executive team, and like we've already kind of like to use your word, like sparred a little bit of like back and forth and like debated, then it makes us better and like represents us really like in that team kind of credible way to be like, here's what we weighed, here's what we thought about. And it's a more, I think, like comfortable conversation too, probably for the rest of the executive team. That's like, okay, great. Like they're aligned financially and from a people perspective. Like that doesn't mean people are always going to love the answer, but it does mean that there's a lot of data and a lot of discussion and thought that go into it.
Thank you.
If I could just jump in, I want to address something Lexi keeps referencing, which is like, we argue, spar, whatever the verb is going to use. Like that's healthy. You should be.
Yeah.
Right. It's never combative between she and I, but Lexi's a really smart person and I'm going to value what she has to say. I just may not agree with it. And she may not agree with what I have to say, but at least we get it out there and we articulate our case and then we can try to find common ground from there. I think that's really important. Because I'm kind of a toss it out there and let's go. Like I think healthy debate is really important. I think it's when people don't surface those disagreements and try to hide them or try to go around to the CEO or something like that, or just kind of hope they bury them and like they'll somehow magically get solved. I think that's where the problems come up. Like that's where the numbers don't tie. That's where you break the philosophy. That's where you break the plan, wherever it is. So. I think disagreeing or having varying opinions on things is probably how it should be.
I agree.
And then you kind of work together to get to the answer from there.
Plus, we have fun while doing it. Like, not that I know we talked a lot about friction, but like Philip and I have a good amount of fun. And like, I know that might sound silly, like in like this conversation, but like the reality is like both him and I want the best thing for the organization. We just view it sometimes in two different lenses or lenses that overlap, but then just differentiate just enough. And so, those conversations, I think I like how you talked about that, like Philip, because I think it's healthy. And I also think I don't know, I walk out of those conversations also feeling like I am better or thinking about things in a better way because I'm like, okay, great. Like I feel like I understand a bigger context and a broader context than just what I'm trying to manage towards.
Well, thank you both. You've shared some great insights on what keeps you up at night as we think about having conversations with the CFO, and some great advice for comp pros on how to make this relationship work. I didn't maybe have to play the mediator as much as I thought I might do. Obviously, listeners, if you need me to come and play mediator between you and your CFO, happy to do that. No, not really. But as we close out, one final piece of advice, Philip, for the comp community to help them sleep better and prepare for 2026?
Lexi's advice about knowing your numbers is always just vital in dealing with any finance person. But let me, that's generic. I'm sure most CFOs would say that. Let me re-articulate a phrase that a former boss of mine used to say that I think makes a lot of sense. He would say, hey, constraints breed creativity. And so it really is true. Like a lot of times you can have kind of too much goodness that makes it easy. You don't have to make hard choices. You don't have to get creative. And you kind of end up, with a business or an entity or a company, whatever organization you're dealing with that, maybe isn't operating as well as it could. So I think people kind of absorbing that thought and recognizing that thought and kind of being able to deal with that is probably an important concept when dealing with somebody on the finance side, because I think a good CFO, a good finance team will place constraints at the appropriate places in the chain and at the appropriate amounts to help drive that creativity. So it's not to be mean. It's not to be punitive. It's not to say, hey, we just don't like spending money because I'll spend the right money in the right place if it's the right return for sure. But we want good dollars to come from those dollars we're spending, or good pounds to come from those pounds we're spending, right? So the concept that constraints drive creativity, I think, is one for people, everybody. But I think in this conversation, Lexi and I have to kind of just always keep in mind.
Love that concept. Any last piece of advice from you, Lexi?
I mean, I think I feel like I didn't know that I was going to have to go out after Philip, and that was very eloquently put. So I think the biggest thing I would say is if you're running into those points of healthy debate or healthy friction, more conversations are better than less. And I use that as the example of let's talk about mid-year again and us kind of building the budget. We have a budget. We're in the midst of the mid-year process. we know that both Philip and members of his team are new to that. And so we've indexed to say, well, why don't we check in a couple times during the process to make sure that like we're not getting to the end and surprising you with anything that you're like, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? What's happening? And that allows us, I think, to stay aligned. But that might feel like a little bit more investment of time, but that time pays off. Like that alignment means by the time that we go and plan for 26, we can say, I don't want to do this again. Or, hey, I loved when we did this. Let's spend more time in conversations there. I think it just like drives ultimately better alignment, better decision making. So don't shy away from those moments, right? Like we've joked about kind of like friction and healthy debate and all these other things. Don't shy away from that because every, I think, debate or friction point is an opportunity for clarity. And I think that clarity can help you not just in the short term, but in the long term as well. I think Philip's was better, but like,
I'm not scoring. I'm not scoring here. So, all right. Well, a huge thank to you both for sharing how HR and finance can come together to treat compensation as a strategic lever and not just a budget line. Some really practical and useful advice. Hopefully you all enjoyed listening into that. Couple of call outs before we close out the episode. We know budget season is coming up. As we record this, our salary budget survey has just gone live. I think it's on pre-release as I literally record this. But by the time the episode is posted, salary budget survey will be live and available for you at payscale.com. So if you want to know what people are predicting their budgets are going to be in 2026, then go to Payscale and you can access that information for free. And also, if you're a Payscale customer, we're running a fun little contest over on Payscale Connect, and we want to hear from you about what is actually keeping you up at night when it comes to comp planning. You can share your thoughts on Connect in a thread, and you'll be entered into a random draw for some great swag. So you can find the link to participate in that competition or that draw in the episode resources section of this podcast. So hopefully you'll make it over to Connect to have a go there. So thank you again, Lexi. Thank you again, Philip. And until next time, keep the coffee hot and your comp strategy even smarter. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lexi. Thanks, Ruth.